Bridgeport, Connecticut, April 6, 2023. At 11:23 a.m., the police dispatch logged a 911 call from Coachlight Square Apartments. The caller reported hearing a baby crying for hours inside Unit 333. No movement, no sign of the mother. Just silence, except for the persistent wail of a child, too young to understand abandonment. When officers arrived, the front door was locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry. The hallway was quiet, the neighbors unaware or unwilling to speculate. In towns like this, people learn to mind their own business. But even here, certain silences felt wrong. Inside the apartment, the smell of stale air mingled with the faint trace of gunpowder. The living room remained undisturbed. A half-empty coffee mug sat on the counter. A baby's bottle, cold and untouched, rested beside it. Light still on. In the back bedroom, Brianna McCoy lay face down, a single gunshot wound to the head. She was 23, no defensive wounds, no sign of a struggle. Death was immediate, execution style. The infant, just over a year old, sat in the corner crib, unharmed but dehydrated, crying softly. The officer secured the scene, called in detectives, and waited for the crime scene unit. There was no forced entry. The apartment's doorframe was intact, latch undamaged. Whoever came here, Brianna had likely let them in. The familiarity of the crime scene suggested something closer than random violence. By early afternoon, Sergeant Kevin Cronin stood in that bedroom, 15 years in homicide. This wasn't his first domestic homicide, but something here was unsettling. Too clean. No hesitation, no overkill. One shot, precise, almost professional. One round tells a story, he muttered, half to himself. The medical examiner arrived at 2:14 p.m., time of death estimated between 9:30 and 10 a.m. There were no fresh bruises, no defensive markings. Brianna hadn't fought. She hadn't seen it coming. A 9mm casing lay partially hidden beneath the dresser. No weapon recovered. In the kitchen, her phone remained on the counter, unlocked. The last activity was a text message sent at 9:12 a.m., unread by the recipient. One message stood out, time-stamped the night before. "If something happens to me, please tell my mom I love her." Detectives moved methodically. No fingerprints except Brianna's on the surfaces. The baby's father, Derek Francis, known to law enforcement, was absent. His name appeared repeatedly in prior domestic disturbance calls. No open warrants. But this wasn't the first time his name came up in a file marked domestic. At 3:47 p.m., an APB went out for Francis. Known vehicle, dark gray Toyota Corolla, last seen registered in Bridgeport. By then, he was already gone. Detectives canvassed the building. One neighbor recalled hearing a heated argument late the night before, around midnight. Another swore there was nothing unusual. Conflicting accounts, typical, but Francis's name came up again and again. Forensic technicians began processing the scene. Brianna's body was transported for autopsy. The casing was bagged and logged, fired from a semi-automatic, likely a standard-issue Glock. Gunshot residue tests were negative on the child. The shooter was careful. By the time dusk fell, the press circled outside Coachlight Square. Word had gotten out. Brianna McCoy wasn't just another name. She was the daughter of reggae artist Ricky Trooper. The headlines would write themselves, but for the detectives, the focus remained tight. Cause, means, opportunity. The apartment door closed quietly behind Cronin as he left the scene. No break-in, no signs of robbery. This was personal. At 8:16 a.m. the following day, Detective Kevin Cronin requested the incident history on Brianna McCoy and Derek Francis. Bridgeport PD's domestic disturbance log showed 6 prior calls to the same apartment over a span of 2 years. Each entry painted a consistent picture, verbal disputes escalating to threats, but no formal charges filed. Brianna declined to press charges every time. The last report, just 3 weeks prior, involved neighbors reporting loud shouting, items breaking. When officers arrived, both parties downplayed the incident. This wasn't unusual. In cases of domestic violence, the patterns often repeat without intervention. Victims stay. Abusers escalate. The files were procedural, clinical, but between the lines, the cycle was clear. At 9:02 a.m., the medical examiner's preliminary autopsy report arrived. The bullet entered the left parietal region of Brianna's skull at close range, slightly upward trajectory. Stippling, small burns from gunpowder residue, confirmed the muzzle was less than 2 feet from her head. No signs of defensive wounds. Toxicology, negative. She hadn't ingested drugs or alcohol before death. The cause of death, gunshot wound to the head, manner homicide. Cronin reviewed the report in silence. One shot, executed cleanly. No second guessing. Whoever pulled the trigger intended to kill, not intimidate. There was no hesitation pattern in the gunpowder residue. It wasn't a warning, it was deliberate. At 10:41 a.m., technicians processed Brianna's phone data. Her text message history reflected sporadic contact with friends, family, and co-workers. But 3 days before the murder, there was a series of unsent drafts. The content suggested mounting fear. He won't let me leave, but no addressee. No one received these messages. Drafted, abandoned. The digital timeline revealed the final outgoing message sent at 9:12 a.m. the morning of her death. A text to a close friend asking to meet later that day. Unanswered. The question lingered. Why draft messages without sending them? Fear of escalation or surveillance? At noon, the forensic team expanded the search to Brianna's laptop and tablet. Her social media login revealed no activity in the 24 hours before her death. However, several browser searches caught the technicians' attention. Emergency shelters near me. Restraining order Connecticut. Timestamped within the past week. This indicated she was preparing to leave. Cronin flagged the searches. Preparing to leave an abuser is statistically one of the most dangerous moments for a victim, but preparation didn't guarantee escape. In this case, it didn't happen fast enough. At 3:27 p.m., investigators reviewed DVR footage from the apartment complex. No external camera faced Brianna's unit directly, but the parking lot feed logged a dark sedan leaving at 9:36 a.m., approximately 10 minutes after the estimated time of death. The vehicle matched the make and model of Francis's Toyota Corolla. The license plate was unreadable due to sun glare and angle. Too convenient, Cronin thought. The timing, the alignment, it fit too perfectly. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. By the end of the day, Francis's phone records were subpoenaed. His number had pinged on a tower near the Bridgeport complex at 8:52 a.m. April 6th. The next ping came from a tower near Danbury at 10:24 a.m., heading west toward the state border. His digital footprint aligned with the physical evidence. Location data alone wasn't proof of guilt, but it positioned him within a timeline that narrowed further with every forensic detail. Francis's prior interactions with law enforcement showed no felony convictions. He had minor infractions from his early 20s, nothing violent on record. But his immigration file, obtained through federal databases, noted a history of anger management issues from prior counseling sessions in Jamaica before relocating to the United States. Nothing conclusive, but enough to paint a behavioral profile. A man who viewed control as entitlement. By evening, Brianna's autopsy was finalized. The single shot severed critical neural pathways instantly. Death was immediate. No suffering. But the broader suffering, her child, her family, was just beginning. Cronin logged the day's findings, closing his laptop before leaving the station. Patterns don't lie, he noted, but we still need the trigger. By April 8th, 2023, 2 days after the discovery of Brianna McCoy's body, the investigation shifted from local containment to a multi-state manhunt. The forensic evidence, autopsy details, bullet trajectory, digital footprints, established a working theory. But theory doesn't apprehend a suspect. The next phase required tracking a man who had vanished without leaving a straightforward trail. At 7:42 a.m., a request went out to the FBI's Violent Crimes Apprehension Program, VICAP, for assistance in cross-referencing Derek Francis's last known movements. His vehicle, a dark gray Toyota Corolla, remained unlocated, but cell tower data from April 6 pinpointed a westward trajectory. After the final ping in Danbury, Connecticut, his phone went dark. It wasn't turned off. It was discarded. The timeline tightened further. At 9:36 a.m., the vehicle resembling Francis's exited the parking lot of Coachlight Square. By 10:24 a.m., tower data placed his phone near Danbury. The gap aligned precisely with the estimated time of Brianna's death. At 10:11 a.m., the Connecticut State Police confirmed a license plate reader, LPR, hit on a vehicle matching Francis's Corolla outside Waterbury, Connecticut at 9:58 a.m. The plates were registered, but the vehicle passed the checkpoint too fast for a positive identification. Still, the sequence remained consistent, east to west, moving out of state. By 1:23 p.m., the investigation expanded into New York and Pennsylvania. The case no longer hinged on probable cause, but on probable flight. Detectives circulated Francis's description, vehicle information, and his last known image, captured from a gas station in Bridgeport just 2 days before the murder. His expression there was neutral, unremarkable. Reviewing the footage, Cronin paused. Francis paid in cash. No card trail, no phone active. Every step calculated. Investigators interviewed family members. At 3:42 p.m., Francis's sister in Hartford provided a formal statement. She hadn't spoken to him in over a week. She described him as intense but not violent. The pattern was familiar. Families often defend, even when doubt creeps in. However, a cousin in New Rochelle, New York, revealed more. He recalled a phone call from Francis late on April 5th, mentioning things weren't working out with Brianna. The cousin assumed it was relationship frustration. He didn't report the call earlier because he didn't want to get involved. This disclosure, though not direct evidence, reinforced Francis's frame of mind leading up to the homicide. It wasn't spur of the moment. It was a situation spiraling toward finality. On April 9th at 5:17 p.m., detectives received word from Ohio State Highway Patrol. A vehicle matching the description of Francis's Corolla was captured on a toll camera outside Columbus, Ohio. The timestamp, April 7th, 4:52 p.m., nearly 36 hours after Brianna's death. The manhunt centered there, cross-referencing hotel and motel records within a 30-mile radius of the last toll camera hit. Investigators identified a cash-only transaction at a low-budget roadside motel. The clerk confirmed the booking but provided minimal details. No security cameras covered the parking lot or interior hallways, a dead zone in the digital trail. At 7:33 p.m., federal marshals joined local authorities to coordinate surveillance and stakeouts. The priority was apprehension without escalation. As night fell over Columbus, the fugitive remained one step ahead. The investigation remained methodical, each piece of digital evidence narrowing the possibilities. Francis had gone off-grid, but the data still spoke. April 10th, 2023. At 6:42 a.m., Ohio State Highway Patrol forwarded the surveillance stills captured at a toll booth outside Columbus. The suspect's vehicle, a dark gray Toyota Corolla, was confirmed crossing into Franklin County. The timestamp aligned with the manhunt's expanding timeline, narrowing Derek Francis's last known location. The vehicle's direction and timing suggested deliberate movement toward low-visibility areas. Detectives coordinated with U.S. Marshals Service to establish a fugitive apprehension plan. The investigative focus shifted from data analysis to tactical execution. All motel records within a 30-mile radius of the toll booth were reviewed. One cash-only transaction stood out, a booking at a roadside motel in Reynoldsburg, Ohio. The reservation, made under an alias, included no identification, but matched the vehicle's description parked in the back lot. At 2:13 p.m., a surveillance operation was authorized. Two unmarked vehicles staged near the property's perimeter, observing patterns. No external security cameras, no digital trail inside the motel. The suspect had chosen an area designed for anonymity. For 10 hours, surveillance teams monitored activity. Lights in room 117 remained off until just after midnight. At 12:17 a.m. on April 11th, a male figure exited the room, walked toward the vending machines, glanced once at the lot, and returned. His posture, height, and clothing matched Francis's known description. No additional guests entered or exited. At 4:43 a.m., based on the confirmed sighting, marshals executed the warrant. The entry team approached room 117 quietly. No resistance. The door opened after the first knock, Francis standing inside, dressed but unarmed. He complied with verbal commands, was restrained, and transported to the Franklin County Jail without incident. Inside the room, a limited search yielded cash, $1,320 in small denominations, folded beneath the mattress. No identification cards, no phone. However, tucked inside the glove compartment of his vehicle, investigators recovered a semi-automatic Glock 19 pistol with a partially loaded magazine. The serial number was filed off, but ballistic testing would later confirm it matched the casing recovered from Brianna McCoy's apartment. At 7:26 a.m., Francis was booked, fingerprints processed, DNA samples collected. The next phase focused on forensic validation, establishing irrefutable connections between him, the crime scene, and the recovered weapon. By 10:34 a.m., the Bridgeport PD was notified. Detective Cronin reviewed the arrest documentation. The process now pivoted to evidence alignment, firearm tracing, ballistic matching, and reconstructing the suspect's movements. In parallel, technicians initiated comparative analysis. The 9mm shell casing retrieved from McCoy's apartment underwent microscopic examination against the Glock 19's test-fired rounds. At 3:52 p.m., forensic ballistics confirmed a match. Striation patterns, unique markings from the weapon's barrel, were identical. Further, latent fingerprints lifted from the Glock's magazine aligned with Francis's prints. There were no secondary fingerprints, reinforcing his exclusive possession. The weapon provided the forensic link tying suspect to scene to victim. On April 12th, federal agents continued processing the vehicle. Trace evidence collection focused on fibers, hair, and biological materials. A partial blood smear, undetectable to the naked eye, was revealed using luminol along the trunk's inner lining. DNA testing would take days, but preliminary presumptive tests indicated the presence of human blood. The vehicle's GPS module, though deactivated, retained location logs prior to shutdown. The log file, retrieved by technicians, detailed Francis's route from Bridgeport to Columbus, with stops in Danbury and western Pennsylvania. The trajectory reinforced the cell tower pings and LPR hits, confirming the travel pattern that led to his apprehension. With ballistic evidence secured, forensic timelines aligned, and the suspect in custody, the investigative framework solidified. Yet one critical element remained: the suspect's account. April 13th, 2023. By the time Derek Francis was transferred from Franklin County Jail back to Bridgeport, the investigation had already secured its primary forensic connections. The firearm matched, the vehicle traced, the digital movement corroborated. But data alone doesn't close a case. Interrogation remains the key procedural step in transitioning evidence from circumstantial to prosecutable. At 9:14 a.m., Francis was seated in the interview room of Bridgeport PD's homicide unit. No restraints, no visible tension. A standard metal table separated him from detectives Kevin Cronin and Sarah Mendoza, both experienced in structured interrogation. The room's setup was deliberate: no distractions, no windows, a controlled environment. The interview followed the Reed technique. Initial rapport building was minimal, as the subject offered no willingness to engage. Francis maintained a neutral posture, his responses measured. When asked to account for his whereabouts on April 6th, he claimed he had left Connecticut 2 days prior to the homicide. He described traveling west, seeking work opportunities in Ohio. No mention of Brianna McCoy, no acknowledgement of his vehicle's presence near the crime scene. At 10:03 a.m., Mendoza introduced the first layer of evidence. The vehicle registered in Francis's name was captured on toll cameras and LPR systems moving westbound from Bridgeport the morning of April 6th. Francis shifted in his seat but maintained his narrative. He suggested someone else had used his car, offering no names. This response was procedural deflection. The detectives continued, introducing the ballistic report at 10:47 a.m. The Glock 19 recovered from his vehicle matched the 9mm casing found at the crime scene. Francis remained silent for several seconds. He asked for the time. No further comments. The interview paused for a legal consult at 11:12 a.m. Francis declined to waive his right to counsel moving forward. Standard protocol was observed. But in that 58-minute session, key behavioral markers were documented: avoidance, minimal denials, and controlled affect. Meanwhile, forensic technicians finalized the DNA analysis on the blood trace found in Francis's vehicle trunk. At 2:46 p.m., the results confirmed a match to Brianna McCoy's DNA profile. The likelihood ratio exceeded 1 in a quadrillion, statistically irrefutable. The next morning, April 14th, detectives re-engaged. With counsel present, the focus shifted. Instead of pursuing admissions, the strategy aimed at confronting Francis with the alignment of forensic data: his car, his weapon, Brianna's blood. At 9:32 a.m., when presented with the DNA results, Francis maintained his earlier position: no confession, no explanation. In cases like this, absence of a confession does not derail prosecution. The goal was never dependent on an admission. The forensic framework stood independently. However, every interview, every denial, added context to his defense posture. At 3:58 p.m., law enforcement issued the formal charge: murder in the first degree under Connecticut Penal Code. Section 53 of 54A. This charge carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 25 years to life, without the possibility of parole. April 15th, the case file expanded with forensic sequencing. Ballistics, match confirmed, DNA, positive for Brianna McCoy in the vehicle, Digital evidence, cell tower, toll cameras, GPS module confirmed the escape trajectory, each piece integrated into a prosecutorial timeline. Motive, means, opportunity. Detective Cronin reviewed the file that evening. The physical evidence, digital patterns, and suspects' behavioral markers aligned too tightly to be coincidental. But procedural thoroughness required continual review. The data spoke. It was now up to the courts to listen. The state of Connecticut, v. Derek Francis, was scheduled to begin in March 2025. Nearly 2 years had passed since Brianna McCoy's body was found in her Bridgeport apartment. In that time, the forensic evidence had been cataloged, the legal strategies formed, and the case positioned for trial. Francis waived his right to a jury, electing instead for a bench trial presided over by a 3-judge panel. This decision, standard in high-profile cases with significant forensic weight, allowed for a focus on evidentiary interpretation without the variables of jury perception. On the first day of trial, the prosecution opened with a structured timeline, presenting the chain of evidence without embellishment. Brianna McCoy's autopsy report led the sequence. Cause of death, a single gunshot wound to the head. Distance, close range. Weapon, 9mm semi-automatic. The firearm recovered from Francis's vehicle matched the casing found at the scene, confirmed through ballistic striation analysis. The report, dated April 12, 2023, remained uncontested in its conclusions. Next, the digital forensics entered the record. Cell tower data pinpointed Francis's phone near the crime scene at 8:52 a.m. on April 6, 2023. The subsequent tower hits, tracking his westward movement, aligned with the toll camera captures and LPR hits across Connecticut and into Ohio. The GPS module extracted from Francis's vehicle, despite being disabled, provided log coordinates that mirrored the tower data. The sequence was clear. Movement from the scene across state lines, culminating in his arrest near Columbus. The defense raised procedural objections regarding the GPS data recovery, citing potential mishandling. The court reviewed the forensic acquisition logs, confirming chain of custody. The objection was overruled. The data remained admissible. The prosecution's presentation of the DNA evidence came on day 3. The blood trace, found in the trunk of Francis's car, matched Brianna McCoy's DNA profile with a likelihood ratio exceeding 1 in a quadrillion. The forensic scientist called to testify detailed the collection and analysis process, affirming its integrity. The defense cross-examined, focusing on contamination risks, but the forensic chain held. No breach in procedure was identified. Throughout the trial, Francis remained composed, seated between his attorneys. His posture was neutral, his gaze fixed forward. The court did not require commentary from him at this stage, and none was offered. The prosecution introduced text message records from Brianna McCoy's phone. The drafts, unsent messages outlining her fear of Francis, were admitted into evidence, establishing motive. The search history on Brianna's devices, including emergency shelters near me and restraining order Connecticut, further contextualized the relationship's deterioration. Witnesses were limited. Brianna's close friend testified about the last text message she received, scheduling a meeting later on the day of the homicide. The friend recalled Brianna's growing anxiety over Francis's behavior, but acknowledged she never heard direct threats. Francis's defense rested largely on framing the homicide as an act committed in a state of emotional disturbance. They argued that Francis's actions, while unlawful, were impulsive rather than premeditated. The defense introduced psychological evaluations, suggesting Francis exhibited signs of emotional dysregulation under stress. However, the prosecution countered with the methodical nature of the crime scene. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, one shot delivered at close range. The evidence suggested control, not impulsivity. Court adjourned for closing arguments. The prosecution reiterated the alignment of forensic data, ballistic matches, digital footprints, DNA evidence. The defense underscored the absence of a confession and emphasized Francis's psychological evaluations. The panel of judges retired to deliberate. In a procedural case, where forensic layers align so completely, deliberation rarely extends long. But no trial is guaranteed. The panel requested additional review of the ballistic testimony and GPS data before finalizing their verdict. April 25, 2025. The panel of 3 judges reconvened in Bridgeport Superior Court. After 6 days of testimony, forensic presentations, and legal arguments, The case against Derek Francis moved toward resolution. The decision would rest solely on the evidentiary strength presented, the procedural integrity of law enforcement, and the interpretive framework of the court. At 9:03 a.m., the courtroom assembled. The state's case stood on the triangulation of forensic evidence, ballistic striation matches, GPS and toll records, and DNA confirmation from the trunk of Francis's vehicle. The defense maintained its focus on emotional disturbance, arguing that while Francis committed the act, it lacked the hallmarks of premeditation required for a first-degree murder conviction under Connecticut law. The presiding judge delivered the panel's findings. The decision unfolded methodically. The ballistic match between the Glock 19 found in Francis's possession and the casing at the crime scene was upheld. The striation patterns, unique to the weapon's barrel, were deemed scientifically reliable, corroborated by peer-reviewed methodologies. No procedural errors were identified in the weapon's recovery or analysis. The GPS data retrieved from Francis's disabled module, alongside the cell tower records and toll captures, established a consistent travel timeline. The judges noted that while the defense questioned the method of GPS retrieval, the chain of custody remained intact. The movement of Francis's vehicle aligned precisely with the known time of death, reinforcing the prosecution's timeline. The DNA evidence proved conclusive. The blood trace found in the trunk of Francis's car matched Brianna McCoy's DNA profile to a statistically irrefutable degree. The defense's arguments regarding potential contamination failed to produce counter-evidence or expert testimony to discredit the results. The court ruled that the homicide exhibited clear premeditation. The evidence demonstrated that Francis traveled to Brianna's apartment, accessed the premises without forced entry, delivered a single close-range gunshot wound without signs of struggle, and departed the scene immediately after. The calculated disposal of his phone, the disabling of his vehicle's GPS, and his flight across state lines further supported intent and consciousness of guilt. At 9:47 a.m., the judges delivered the verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree. Following the verdict, the sentencing phase proceeded without delay. Under Connecticut law, first-degree murder carries a sentence of 25 to 60 years imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The prosecution recommended the maximum, citing the methodical nature of the crime and Francis's lack of remorse. During sentencing arguments, the defense presented a psychological assessment that reiterated Francis's history of emotional instability and prior counseling records from Jamaica. The court acknowledged the assessment but determined that these factors did not mitigate the premeditated nature of the act. On April 28, 2025, Derek Francis was sentenced to 60 years in state prison, no parole eligibility, no reduction in sentence for good behavior. The formal close of the case included an official statement from the Bridgeport Police Department, underscoring the alignment between forensic evidence and procedural diligence. The case was cited as a model for interagency cooperation and forensic integration, involving local law enforcement, state police, federal marshals, and forensic analysts across jurisdictions. From a legal standpoint, the case stood on its forensic merits. No confessions were needed. No eyewitnesses were required. The integration of physical evidence, digital tracking, and DNA analysis rendered the defense's alternative narrative untenable. As Francis was remanded to custody, no statement was given. He exited the courtroom without incident. The formal conclusion of State v. Derek Francis ended the procedural phase. Yet the broader implications on domestic violence prevention, forensic methodology, and public awareness would continue. Following Derek Francis's conviction and sentencing, the case file on Brianna McCoy's homicide formally closed within the judicial system. The forensic sequence remained intact. Ballistics, DNA, digital tracking, all corroborated the prosecution's narrative from discovery to conviction. But outside the courtroom, the impact of Brianna's death extended beyond evidence and verdicts. Ricky Trooper, Brianna's father, issued a brief public statement after the sentencing. As a prominent figure in the reggae music community, his grief became a focal point for broader discussions around domestic violence and its often invisible escalation. His words were clear. The justice system had acted, but justice itself felt incomplete. He emphasized that no legal outcome could reverse the loss of his daughter or mend the rupture left in her child's life. Bridgeport law enforcement reviewed the case internally, documenting its handling as a model of interagency coordination. The timely collaboration between local detectives, federal marshals, and forensic units across multiple states allowed for the quick apprehension of Francis and the airtight consolidation of physical evidence. The investigation was cited during training seminars on domestic homicide response strategies, particularly focusing on digital forensic integration, cell tower triangulation, GPS recovery, and data chain of custody procedures. Beyond procedural efficiency, the case reignited local advocacy efforts. In the months following the trial, Connecticut legislators introduced proposals aimed at enhancing protections for individuals in volatile domestic relationships. These included expanded funding for emergency shelters, streamlined restraining order processes, and improved digital privacy education for at-risk individuals. At the heart of the policy discussions was Brianna's search history. Her unsent text drafts, her online queries for shelters and restraining orders highlighted a common and dangerous pattern. Victims often seek help quietly, fearing that overt action could provoke escalation. These digital traces became a case study in recognizing early warning signs and empowering intervention before fatal outcomes occur. Brianna's child, now in the care of extended family, remained at the center of the ongoing emotional aftermath. While legal closure had been achieved, the long-term effects on her family required more than court rulings. Social services worked closely with the family, providing counseling and long-term support for the child. The Bridgeport Police Department's Victim Support Division included the McCoy case in its internal review, analyzing missed opportunities for early intervention. In broader terms, the homicide stood as a procedural example of modern forensic practice, where physical evidence, digital footprints, and investigative collaboration form a triad that reinforces legal accountability. No confessions were extracted. No eyewitnesses were required. The facts, embedded in data and forensic science, constructed the narrative that led to conviction. But beneath the procedural success, the human cost persisted. Domestic violence remains one of the most pervasive and underreported crimes in the United States. Brianna McCoy's case, while resolved in court, became a reminder that intervention windows are narrow and easily missed. In the final analysis, the case underscored two central realities. Forensic science delivers legal clarity, but prevention requires societal vigilance. Every unsent message, every unanswered query for help reflects a gap that, if left unaddressed, can close too quickly. Justice in the courtroom can never replace a life lost. But every case like Brianna McCoy's reminds us how critical it is to recognize warning signs before tragedy strikes. If someone you know feels trapped or unheard, reach out. Don't wait for the headlines. Early intervention saves lives. I've shared this story not just to recount the facts, but to urge reflection. How do we as a community step up before it's too late? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Where are you tuning in from? What would you have done differently? And if this story moved you, consider subscribing for more true stories that matter.